Welcome to our webinar series on participation and representation in the digital age. My name is Jenny Oser, and I'm a professor of politics and government at Ben-Gurion University. I'm also the principal investigator of an ERC grant on this topic, and I'm honored to introduce our speaker today, Professor Anne Rasmussen of King's College London and the University of Copenhagen. Anne is a professor of political science, and she's also the PI of the ERC project, Advocacy in Digital Democracy. Today, she'll be presenting an article that is currently in press at the American Political Science Review about the costs of running and engaging in politics.
And this is simply like the hypothesis in words, but I already talked about them. The key one to focus on is that we think that messages to female politicians should be perceived as more toxic than to male politicians. And the reason we think this is the case is that we systematically think that the motives inferred, as underlying any given attack should be systematically different when it's a female as opposed to a male politician. And we dig into that in the second experiment. So we think it's when it is a female politician, the reason we should think that it is worse is that we think that our respondents will be more likely to believe that any given attack, so it can be exactly the same thing that is said to a man and a woman, but we think it is perceived as more likely to be driven by prejudice or an attempt to kick the person out of politics if it is said to a woman, as opposed to when it is being said to a man.
Question is this. In light of the findings from your research, do you see possible opportunities for policy change?
Say what countries should do, but I think, as I touched upon a little bit towards the end of the presentation, I think it does mean that considering consent moderation, it can definitely be worthwhile. But if consent moderation is just based on the text itself, that might not be sufficient. So we need maybe to think of consent moderation and the way that algorithms work for singling out potentially toxic behavior. They would have to be sophisticated enough to take some of these contextual factors into account. And that maybe leads actually very well to the second question that Paul asked me, if I may, because you were asking me a little bit whether we actually think that this generalizes beyond gender. Like, can we actually think of this dynamic actually working in other spheres, such as when toxic behavior is addressed, say, towards ethnic minorities or some other kind of sensitive groups in society? And we actually think it might, because the kind of theory we propose here is not a gender-specific theory, right? We are kind of saying that the way this is actually, is going to be perceived depends on the kind of motives that we think it is driven by. So we can very well imagine that if we would sort of be dealing with ethnic minorities instead, saying the same thing to them as was said to, people that were less in an ethnic minority situation would actually be seen as being driven by quite different motives.